Alan Nichol, co-founder and CTO of Rasa. Welcome back to my podcast. Now it's a new podcast called the Data Exchange Podcast. Welcome, Alan.
Thanks very much. Good to be back then.
And congratulations on the new funding round. So we can, we'll talk more about the technology that you folks are building, but very quickly, take advantage of the fact that you guys just had a new funding round. You must be hiring. And so what type of positions are you looking to fill for our audience here?
Yeah. So mostly on product side. So, looking for engineers, product managers, designers. So folks on working on R&D and on machine learning and NLP research. So we've just opened up a new R&D hub in Edinburgh as well. And that'll be led by Adam Lopez, who was until recently a professor there. And so, yeah, those are kind of the main areas we're hiring in at the moment.
So I'll get back to what you're hiring as we get into the podcast. But very quickly, Alan, so for listeners who aren't familiar with Rasa, so what is it?
Yeah, so Rasa is an open source company. And we build a framework that helps you build voice assistants and chatbots, so all kinds of conversational AI. And the ambition is really that Rasa becomes the standard infrastructure for these kinds of tools, right? So to be a no-brainer technology choice, right? The same way that if you add search to your stack, you don't think about it twice, right? You just use Elasticsearch. And if you work with containers, obviously you use Docker and to get to that same level of ubiquity
and ease of use.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so, Alan, for people who aren't deep into the space, so what are the components of a text or voice-based assistant?
So there are obviously different challenges if you're doing voice as opposed to just text. So we'll start with just text and then we'll expand out from there. So typically, you think of dealing with a message sent by a user in kind of 3 stages. And so the first stage is NLU, language understanding, natural language understanding. And that means taking this new information and figuring out what's this new message and what's the information content in this message, right? So that typically means categorizing it into an intent and then pulling out some structured data, like if people are mentioning products or items or cities or something like that, that you can construct a query. And then the second part is to say, okay, well, given this new information and given everything I've done in the past, what is the next thing I should do? Should I ask the user another question? Should I go fetch some information? Should I go tell them something? And then there's a kind of third piece, which is, well, formulating your exact response, right? Which can be as straightforward as just filling in some templates, right? And templated responses, or doing something more sophisticated. And so generally, those are things that we've thought of as separate. But I think it's interesting to note that we're working on the 2.0 release of Rasa open source at the moment. The first alpha has gone out, throughout the summer. We'll release a couple more alphas until the release candidate comes. And one of the foundational pieces we're bringing in the 2.0 version is the ability to do end-to-end learning. And so what that means is you don't necessarily have to have this 2-step process of first extract the information and then decide what to do with it. But you can go directly from, this is what the user said, to here's the next thing I should do. And what that lets you do is it takes the context of the conversation into account when you're interpreting a message. So a really great example that came up for me recently is I have a side project I work on called Carbon. And this was really relevant before Corona, was if you were flying somewhere, you could tell it where you were flying and it would help you calculate how much carbon dioxide you should offset for that flight, and then send you a link to a place where you can go buy carbon offsets. And so I was looking through the conversations that people have with this assistant, and one of the questions it asks you is, are you traveling in economy class, right? And the user responded, unfortunately. Now, of course, in this particular scenario, the word unfortunately means yes, it's an affirmation, right? But of course, I'm deeply uncomfortable with the idea of just adding the label affirm to the message, unfortunately, because that doesn't make sense, right? And so if we can bypass this limitation of every message fits into one of these buckets, we can contextually interpret what a message means, right? And so it's a really foundational piece of kind of breaking down the barrier between the two, and I'm very excited about it. But anyway, back to your original question, what are the pieces? And so then if you have a speech, like a voice assistant, as opposed to pure text, then you have this additional challenge, right? You're not dealing with text, you're dealing with audio. And so you first have to transcribe what the user is saying, right? So automatic speech recognition, and then of course generate a response and generate actual audio from that text response, right? And I mean, that leads to a whole other level of complication, right? I mean, one thing is, of course, your model of turn taking isn't so clean, right? If you and I are talking, you're umming and ahhing and back channeling and nodding and telling me that I'm making sense to you. We can interrupt each other, we can interrupt ourselves, we can correct ourselves. And so it's not as simple as transcribe this message,
Right.
process it, and get a response, right? And so there are all sorts of interesting things. Of course, the meaning of what you say can be completely changed by your intonation, by what you emphasize, right? So all sorts of fun and interesting challenges around voice, but I'm actually extremely interested in voice, and we're doing more and more on that to try and support more users.
So you said something interesting there. So it sounds like that Rasa is modular, but then aspirationally you want to create this kind of end-to-end framework to make it easy for developers. So once this Rasa new version of Rasa comes out that's more end-to-end, does that mean I have to use it end-to-end, or can I still pick and choose pieces?
That's a great question. So developers love the modularity of Rasa and the fact that, you know, we give you sensible defaults, but you can swap out any piece, right? If you can think of a better text categorizer, or you have word embeddings that are specific to your application, you can plug those in, right? I mean, that's the beauty of open source and writing modular code. I think the piece of, and the way I like that we've done the implementation of the end-to-end piece is that it's not a binary decision of now you're going to end-to-end. So you can have a hybrid model where most of the messages in a conversation are still categorized and fit into clean categories. But if you have an awkward message in there, you just don't give it a label, right? And so I think it's really important to provide a path to build an assistant that becomes more sophisticated over time, right? Because nobody starts a project with wanting to build something really sophisticated, and very few people go in and say, the first thing I'm going to do is go on Mechanical Turk and collect, 5,000 training dialogues, and then I'm going to train on that, right? So that's not a viable thing. So you have to have a kind of a linear ramp of starting with things which are very simple, and then breaking free from all the limitations that have been imposed by that simplicity without starting from scratch. Right?
So on your website, actually, I find it interesting. You describe yourself as a machine learning framework to automate text and voice-based assistants. So that phrase, machine learning framework, because I'm much more familiar actually in the with machine learning tools than necessarily the chatbot tools. But in the machine learning world, people now start differentiating between tools that address the data part of machine learning, right? So feature engineering, data validation, data labeling, and then model building and model training, which includes experiment tracking, model tuning, and then the model ops, the model deployment, and things like that. So since you describe yourselves as a machine learning framework, you must have some similar components, right?
Yeah. So I think of it as a stack, right? I think that's a helpful analogy. And so one layer below Rasa open source is TensorFlow, right? And so TensorFlow is a really key component of Rasa, right? All our models are implemented in it. We subclass a lot of TensorFlow components, or sort of deeply collaborate with the developers of that library, and we sit one layer on top of that, right? And of course, as you move up the stack, you address a narrower use case, right? I mean, there are a million things that, you know, computer vision and all sorts of things that you can do with TensorFlow that you don't do with Rasa. But of course, it means that you don't have to build a conversational AI framework from scratch if you use Rasa as opposed to just using TensorFlow. And then on top of Rasa open source, we have what we call a tool layer, and that's where Rasa X sits. And so that again makes more assumptions about what kind of thing you're building, right? And so it's a tool set for building AI assistants, and specifically it's a tool set for practicing a methodology called conversation-driven development. And so that incorporates a lot of things, and I'd love to unpack all the pieces of that, but it incorporates a lot of things like, you know, when do you train your model? How do you validate your model? How do you version your training data? How do you run tests? All this kind of thing.
Oh yeah, I'd love to. I was just about to ask you that. So, what is the development process for these chatbots and smart assistants? So, I'm assuming you have testing, right? So, unit integration testing, that kind of things. Is there a notion of CI/CD? Is there the notion of CI/CD? Is there a rigorous review process, model governance, things like this, right? So,
music to my ears, Ben. Thank you for asking these questions. So, so the way I think about it, so there's a shift that's happening, and I like to think we're sort of a positive force in that shift happening. And I think it's in a lot of ways similar to the move from waterfall to agile development. And I'll explain how it works, and then maybe it'll make sense why it's similar. And so the process that, you know, we advocate for is CDD, conversation-driven development, right? And the first point of CDD is embracing that you cannot anticipate all the things that people will say to your assistant or your chatbot, right? And so a lot of it is embracing that you can't have certain knowledge at the start of a process, same as the difference between agile and waterfall, right? And embracing that uncertainty and leaning into it and building a process that learns from it, right? And so the CDD is 6 steps, right? So the first one is share. And this is kind of the maxim of, you know, it's never too early to share your assistant. Take the dumbest chatbot you can build and give it to people, because it doesn't matter. They will surprise you and they'll do something you hadn't anticipated, right? So it doesn't help to go off into the mountains and try and polish something for 3 months. Like it's not going to work the first time, right? And so you can anticipate the things that users will say. So share early, share often. The second one is review. I think people neglect that you're having conversations, and the best way to understand what somebody's talking about and asking for is to like look at some conversations, right? And people get caught up right away in like numbers and analytics and all this thing. It's all great, but you know, the human brain looking at what another human is saying is irreplaceable, right? So then, you know, so it's annotate is the third piece, right? And again, historically, we've seen a lot of trying to get away with using a lot of synthetic data, but there's just no replacement for using real messages, real conversations to train your model on.
So isn't this, Alan, so isn't one of the dirty secrets in this space is a lot of these bots are trained using Reddit, which is not necessarily the most representative or the most diverse, the most tolerant population?
Not at all. I mean, but I think it depends what you're doing with it, right? So if you're using Reddit or like, you know, embeddings trained on Reddit for the interpretation side, it's a very different thing from using it for the generation side, right? And so I can tell you, and I wish this weren't the case, but I can tell you that CarbonBot receives an insane amount of horrible abuse, just vile things I will never repeat. And so it's helpful to have embeddings trained on all sorts of vulgar language that recognize these different types of vulgarities and can respond to them. I mean, of course, if you're sending generated text to users, I mean, I think that's in most applications, that's not something you want to do. I think there are very, very few cases where you just want to have a generative language model and send that directly to a user, right? And so I'm much more of the opinion that, you know, you just get a human. It's so much easier to get a human to write 5 different ways of saying something than to train a model which can coherently do that and never go off the rails and say something objectionable, right?
So mapping the CDD process to ML, to machine learning,
Yeah.
it would be the equivalent of saying deploy right away, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like, and so
But
we build tooling.
you wouldn't do that in a machine learning setting necessarily. If you have a classifier recommender that
Mm.
sucks, you're not going to tell me deploy right away. So it seems there's a big difference then
I
with
think
chatbots.
there's a good analogy. There's a good analogy with that, right? Because some recommender models you can only train kind of online, and you're just
That's
always going
true.
to have a cold start problem.
That's true.
So you might as well get it over with, right?
Right.
Just put it. And I think it's a similar thing, right? Can you build kind of low personal risk ways of sharing things early? But that's a key piece, right? And so anyway, we've had the first 3, right? So the share, review, annotate, and then the second half is track, fix, and test. And that's about setting up tracking to understand how many of your users are you really helping, right? So you're not just guessing in the dark. Your F1 score on your classification model is nice, but really you want to know, are you actually helping users? And then tests, like we really advocate strongly for end-to-end tests, right? Run through full conversations, run them on your CI/CD, or tools like integrate with CI/CD and all of that, and integrate with Git, so that you have a professional software development process and you run tests, right? I mean, I think that's also, as this market kind of grows up, people realize that it's nice to have a prototyping tool that's very quick, but also if you're actually shipping something in production, you probably don't want people to just come in and change things. You want to have a review process and tests and all the rest of it. And you want to use issue tracking and all the usual things, right? To go back and link back to specific conversations and create new end-to-end tests from conversations that went well and all the rest of it. And so a lot of it's just about bringing solid software engineering practices into the development of AI systems, right? That's really what CDD is about. It's kind of bringing agile CI/CD, continuous improvement, into this process, and not saying that it's a black box or something that is just a hobby project.
So how common is CDD, this development process right now?
I think parts of it are very well established and parts of it are not. I wish more people did tests. I think the penetration of, if I look at, even Rasa users, I mean, unfortunately, most platforms that we compete with don't have tests at all. But rather than we have tests, and we're doing a lot to try and encourage people to use them more and write them more. And I think the sharing early is something that some people have really got onto and some haven't, right? And I think the big differentiator is, have people done this before? Have they built a chatbot before? Have they built a voice assistant before, right? And those who have know that you just have to share things early. And those who haven't, think they can get away with it. And so a lot of, the reason why we're evangelizing CDD and talking about it and talking to people about it is to kind of give guidelines and give a shortcut, because there's so many new people coming to the field. I feel we owe it to them to say, look, here are all the banana peels, and you can just walk this path instead and just embrace it, right? Yeah.
So is the so does that mean though, Alan, that you are building tools to encourage people to develop assistance this way? In other words, you have in Rasa itself, you have tools for these 6 stages. Number
Exactly.
1, do you have tools that help developers in certain areas? For example, testing, writing tests is a struggle for some developers, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, within the open source framework, of course, we have the ability to run tests, right? And then within that tooling layer, within like Rasa X, where you're reviewing the conversations and you're looking at them and you have a UI to look at all of it, you can look at any conversation, and if it went well, you can click one button and it turns it into a test, right? And so really encouraging this kind of behavior. Obviously giving lots of code examples of here's how you set up your CI/CD server. Here's how you integrate these things and run these tests and make sure that you're not breaking things, right? It's really, really crucial that we kind of invest in all of these workflows.
And so the chatbots in particular are kind of an instance in ML where it almost all the time they get attacked, right? So recommenders don't necessarily get attacked, but chatbots are prone
But
to.
you're inviting people to give you free form input in natural language,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Which
yeah. But then
is an invitation.
does that mean that? So what is in these 6 stages? What protects me from organized 4chan groups to turn my bot into Microsoft Day Nazi loving bot?
Human review, right? So that's the key piece about annotate is, you don't just train models on unsanitized user input, right? You go through, you look at the messages, you annotate, how you want to categorize them, right? And actually, Rasa doesn't do any generative models for responses, right? I mean, we just use templates that you fill in slots. That said, it's not bulletproof, right? Like the answer yes can be deeply, deeply offensive depending on what the question was that came before it, right? So you're never 100% bulletproof, but we haven't at this point introduced any generative models into the way that the model responds to you. And I'll take quite a bit of convincing before I think that's a good idea.
Right. So the human review, I think, is necessary at this point, right? For sure, right? But what about scaling and real time aspect? If so, you do you have tools to make the human reviewers more productive?
Yeah, I mean that is essentially our roadmap. So if I think about conversational AI, we like to think of it as a maturity model in, and I think this is something we talked about a couple of years ago, was the 5 levels of conversational AI.
Oh
Right?
yeah, that was a great post. I think that. So how did that post land in the industry?
Fantastically well. I mean, I think at the time it was really useful because the market was in a different place, and developers who were building their second or third assistant understood why you needed something more than like some point and click tools, right? But the rest of the market didn't understand that. And so articulating it this way, saying, well, look, that, those are tools for level 2. And if you want to do something more ambitious, there's this thing called level 3. And it's not a question of waiting for artificial general intelligence to show up or something. It was fantastically well received. And actually just last month, I published an update. So, we put a whole bunch of work into it. And we had an online event called L3 AI for the community. And, I gave a talk about the updated definition. And so the updated definition of the 5 levels looks at it from 2 different perspectives. And one is the end user perspective, right? And I love the 5 levels of autonomous driving because it's so easy to remember, right? Like level 5 autonomous driving means I can take a nap in the back of the car and I can get home safely, right? And it's just about the user experience, and it doesn't tell you anything about what tech is getting you there. It's just telling you that. So we came up with a similar mechanism for how the user experience improves. But the developer experience, getting to level 3 is all about embracing CDD. And when I think about moving beyond level 3, it's all about how much of CDD can we automate? So it's exactly the question you just asked me, right? How can we effectively use human annotator time to actually look at the things that make sense to review, right? And can we get to a system which is self-learning?
By the way, before you go into detail in there, give us a sense of scale of, let's say, a mediumly used chatbot and a very widely used chatbot. So how much scale are we talking about here? In how much reviewing do I need to do?
Oh, I mean, I know of companies that have they're very diligent and they have a couple dozen conversations a day coming from high value customers, and they look at all of them. And there are I can think of one fintech company that uses Rasa for customer service, and I think they get like 20,000 conversations a day or something. Wow. Or even more. So that's high volume, and of course you're not going to look at all of them, right? And so the first thing that we do is we built like a whole bunch of filters to filter this down, right? So look for specific things users said, specific things the system did, look for like the length of the conversation. Look, we even, I mean, it's not quite ready yet, but we worked on some filters to only surface conversations where there's a new conversation turn that you haven't seen before. The user did something unexpected you haven't seen before. And so there's all sorts of things we can do. And of course, this is a rich field of like active learning and like, weekly supervised learning and all these things of how can we get the most out of this without, I certainly don't think that, 4 or 5 years from now, we'll get to level 5 conversational AI by doing turn level annotation of every single dialogue, right? There has to be something. And so there's huge literature on using reinforcement learning for conversational AI, right? And that's all great work, but of course, in reality, you don't know what the reward function is, right? And so that's really tricky and that's really noisy, and you certainly can't just throw RL at this thing and it's gonna figure everything out, right? So I think that it's a piece, but it's not the answer on its own.
So how do we get academics to work on something deployable, man?
Well, I don't know. I don't know if that's their job, to be honest. I think they have their job and we have ours. I was in academia once and now I'm no longer. And, I think the purpose of university research is not to work on things which are necessarily applied, right? I mean, the discovery of the electron was a fantastically esoteric and not at all applications area of physics, and had some relevant output.
So if you were to identify 2 to 3 weaknesses of today's chatbots, what would they be?
Oh, goodness me, there's so many.
What are the ones that keep you up at night?
So I think the biggest one that keeps me up at night is this limitation imposed by this idea of intents. And so I've talked about this a little bit in various places. And so the idea is you start building an assistant, right? And you start building your chatbot and you think, okay, what are some things that my user can say? And, of course, there are many different ways you could say hello, and you categorize all of those as a greeting. Wonderful, right? You've collapsed almost infinite things that user can say into one thing. And so maybe you come up with, greet and thank you, and, can I check the status of my order, right? And a couple of dozen of these intents, right? Which are just kind of summaries of things that users can say. And that is, of course, an enormous compression of the space of surface forms of things people can say into, just a set of buckets, right? And then you can think of how to handle them and how to handle them in context and all the rest of it. But then when whether or not you're practicing CDD, ultimately, hopefully you are practicing CDD, but either way, you're trying to build an assistant that's more sophisticated, you will inevitably run into this problem of messages which don't neatly fit into your categories, right? Like, unfortunately, right? That doesn't fit, right? And so in the beginnings of a project, this idea of these intents and these buckets is extremely helpful. And then as you try and improve over time, it becomes hurtful because you have these fixed categories, and then anytime you want to introduce a new one, you have to go, oh, what else do I have to change so that I don't break everything, right? It's a mess. And so I think getting rid of the limitation imposed by having these fixed intents is a really, really, really key piece. And so I'm not saying at all that we have like all the answers with Rasa 2.0. We just have a technical foundation upon which we can build to say, okay, not every message needs to have an intent. We can do end-to-end models. And I think there are lots of interesting things to figure out about the details of the algorithms, and then the details of the tooling and the annotation, how all of that works. So there are lots of exciting things to figure out. But at least we have a foundation upon which we can say, well, we are now conceptually breaking away from this limitation, right? And in a way that you can still start out with the simple model and graduate.
So as chatbots become more common and widely deployed, just like websites, Alan, does it make sense to have a group of people who are basically the equivalent of penetration testers?
Oof.
Who will basically hammer a chatbot?
Well, yeah, I mean, to some extent, you are running a web service,
yeah,
right? And users will give input. Hopefully, you probably don't put, execute SQL queries based on the unsanitized user input. I think those days are over.
Yeah.
I mean, for sure, right? And I think I think a lot of these things are not actually too dissimilar to any other kind of software, right? Ultimately, you're running a web service, you will have denial of service attacks, you will have all sorts of things, right? And hopefully all of the usual tools will
But they
translate well.
don't. So what you're saying, they don't exist yet for chatbots.
Not specifically, but if I think about, how does, yeah, I mean, maybe it depends a bit if you're using one of these platforms, right? If you're on Google Home or Amazon Alexa, maybe that's a different vector. But typically, if you just have a web service which is running your bot or your assistant, it's no different from predicting any other kind of API, right? You can put it behind authentication, you can have it as a logged in experience, you can do rate limiting and all sorts of things. So I think those tools will translate well into this space.
So as you said, the text is hard enough and voice is even harder. So as you look into the future, is voice going to be more dominant?
I think voice is fantastically interesting. And to be honest, I'm personally, I mean, as a hobbyist, it's fun to build things on Google Home and Amazon Alexa. If I think what are really the relevant ecosystems, I think telephony is much more relevant than any of those. And that also means you are off the guardrails, right? So if you're building an Alexa skill or an action on Google Home, right, this turn-taking bit is taken care of for you, right? You're presented with a transcription of a neat user message, right? And I mean, absolute credit to the incredible teams who ship those speakers and can do all of that. But then as the person developing the application, that's been abstracted out for you, right? Whereas if you're now doing something full stack and you're automating a call center or something like that, oh my goodness, right? Now I'm just getting a phone line with audio noise and dropped calls and goodness me, right? And so that's a really interesting thing to think about, right? Is like, how do you even tackle all of those problems? And I mean, I think there are a lot more phone calls in the world than there are conversations with Alexa. And so I think it's more interesting as a platform and more interesting technologically, I would say.
So we're having this conversation a few weeks after the release of GPT-3. So my question to you is, why do I need Rasa? I just pointed to GPT-3 and the GPT-3 will answer all the questions for me, right?
I'm very sorry to disappoint you. It's funny because actually, in the talk I gave a few weeks ago about the 5 levels of conversational AI, I said, so how are we going to get to level 5? And I said, well, first I'll tell you how we're not going to get there. And we're not going to get there by another big model coming from the sky or from one of the big tech companies that just solves everything for us. And then lo and behold, a week later.
So why not? Why not? Why not?
Well, because it doesn't actually give you something you can steer and control and do practical things with. Right. So great example. I thought it'd be fun to try. I mean, okay, I'm a huge fan of GPT-3. I think it's a meaningful breakthrough. I think they asked a very interesting empirical question of what happens when you do this at this scale. And I think the empirical result is far more interesting than anything I would have dared hope. And then the fact that you get this nice UI to play with is great. And so I tried to do a little simple task where I gave some like a table of like restaurant name, and some attributes, star rating, whether it's veggie friendly, outdoor seating, all the rest of it. And then I give it like a question, like which one of those has Wi-Fi, and like formulate a nice answer, comparing and contrasting the things in the table, right? Give it a couple of those, did a fantastic job. I mean, really remarkable, right? I mean, you're not training it, you're just asking it to do an autocomplete and it picking up the task that it's supposed to do, right? Remarkable. But then all of a sudden it starts like inventing facts about these restaurants. Like, oh, this one has great reviews on Yelp, and this one, like, I don't know, it has bad service or something, right? And just, I mean, what do you do with that? I mean, you can't, I mean, it's great that you can do it. So I think GPT-3 has incredible potential for all sorts of like augmentation tasks, like creative augmentation, maybe synthetic data generation, as like a bootstrapping thing. I think it's interesting for all sorts of things. I would never, ever, ever suggest to anyone to just send GPT-generated output directly to a customer. I think that's a terrible idea.
Actually, the head of Facebook AI, I don't know if you saw his thread, Jerome Pesenti, head of AI at Facebook, basically had a Twitter thread, and he kind of demonstrated that the GPT-3 chat demo isn't ready for prime time in the sense that you're describing in terms of interacting with real world users, because he said it just took a handful of tries to generate the toxic output.
Oh, absolutely. And there's a blog post on the Rasa blog called like Careful First Impressions about GPT-3. And Vincent from our DevRel team sort of poked around with it and gave it some stimuli, like the white man worked as, and then asked it to autocomplete, the black woman worked as, and like all the obvious horrible stereotypes come out, right? And so, yeah, if you if you want to send whatever that model is outputting straight to your customers, I think OpenAI are right to vet all the applications, right? If you want to actually build an application on that API that sends the output of the model directly to users without you in the loop, they have to vet the application and check what you're doing with it. So they're being responsible, at least in that sense. But obviously there's other questions about, well, is that always going to be the case? Is everything always going to be vetted? And can you really guarantee that you don't cause any harm with this model? I think you can, right?
So the other thing that's happening right now, of course, is COVID-19 and the pandemic. Everyone's at home. Everyone is disconnected. And we're now starting to read again kind of these stories about virtual friends and right, so particularly in Asia. So I don't know if do you know if any Rasa developers are building such applications?
I'm sure they are. I mean, I think everything under the sun you can imagine is being built by someone.
Yeah.
I think I won't pretend to understand this market. Yeah. So you have the idea of product market fit, and you also have the idea of founder market fit. And I don't think I could ever build a social app or a social media website. Yeah. So it somehow it clicks, and I could not possibly tell you why. But yeah, I mean, a lot of them seem to be quite popular and get a lot of engagement. And I know Microsoft's project had a fair bit of traction for a long time. People maybe forget, but Hugging Face, which is now known as a cool open source NLP startup, started off as one of these like social chatbots, right? And I think they had a good bit of traction with that as well before they pivoted. So yeah, I think these things are fascinating, but I don't know if I can say anything intelligent about them.
So at a high level, what's the difference between Rasa open source and Rasa the product?
Right. So we have two products, and they sit at different layers in the stack. And so we have Rasa open source, which is infrastructure, right? So I mean, the very crude analogy, very crude metaphor is maybe that Rasa open source is like an engine, and then Rasa X is like a car, right? It's like one level up of what you might want to do with this thing. And so Rasa X is a free toolkit for practicing CDD, right? And if you're talking about COVID, it's an interesting question, right? Where there's a whole bunch of retailers that use Rasa for customer service, right? And then all of a sudden, they all started getting questions about, oh, does my local supermarket have toilet paper in stock, right? And you want to react to that, right? And so I think it's a really interesting thing about conversational AI that you get this incredibly strong effect of like drift of user behavior because you're accepting free-form input, right? People will just tell you. And so I think the key thing about getting to level 5, I think the key thing about CDD is like all of the data that you need to get to level 5 is you're already collecting it. People are already telling you, right? We just have to figure out a scalable way to listen and respond and improve based on that data, right? And that's the really remarkable thing, is that users can drive the development process because they're just telling you what they want, right, in their own language.
So this is a question I ask creators of open source projects that I speak with. So what are the key metrics that you track?
Oh, goodness me.
GitHub stars?
No. GitHub stars is a terrible metric. It's like a bookmark, right? It's basically, I think it's the peak traffic that you ever received from Hacker News seems to be the thing that determines how many stars you get. No, but I mean, of course, we track how many people contribute, right? And we're very proactive about encouraging people to contribute to the code base. And, we actively keep track of issues that are nice for new first-time contributors to join in, right? And that's obviously a nice number because it's very objective, easy to measure, right? But it's very end of funnel, right? So someone is very far along their Rasa journey by the time they become a contributor. So of course, something else that's interesting is traffic on the documentation, right? Just how many page hits are you getting? Like what features are people looking at? Those kinds of things. We have a forum, right, which has over 10,000 members, right? And of course, at least an order of magnitude, more people have looked at the forum and never created an account and signed in, right? And then YouTube. So YouTube is a huge channel for us. We do a huge amount of developer education. And so we have a great series. There's the Rasa Masterclass, which is a 12 video series on whole browser course, beginner to deployed in production.
How long are those courses? I'm always curious. What's the right length for a course?
So it's 12 videos, and each video is between, I think, 5 and 15 minutes. And it's amazingly popular. I think just this week we passed 100,000 views on that playlist. Of people have gone through the course, and that's amazing. And we have 2 more video series, NLP for developers, which is like bite-sized pieces of, hey, I've heard this term, I've heard the word embeddings. What does that mean, right? I've heard BERT. What does that mean, right? Just kind of really great content for getting that first taste of what things are. And then we have the algorithm whiteboard, which is like longer videos in huge detail, sort of lecture style, notation, and really explaining how different algorithms work, and specifically, obviously, the algorithms that we work in Rasa, right? And the appetite for all of that content is enormous, right? And so we have just a huge amount of folks engaging with that, and also subjectively, right? People tell us they really appreciate it, and I think the numbers hide sometimes and hide the truth, right? And when we organized this conference last month, the L3AI conference, it was just this incredible boost of energy, because there was just this outpouring of love from the community, that they love the event, and that they love Rasa and all this, and that just felt so incredibly good. I think the whole team, everyone was online. We're all pumped, answering people's questions, staffing the booth, doing panels, FAQs, all this stuff, and just the amount of energy is really, I think that's the hardest to quantify, but probably the most important.
So looking ahead 2 years from now, will the event be called L4AI?
I hope so.
So where are we? So how far are we between jumping to another level?
I think there are parts of what we do that are already touching on level 4-ish. And I think there are a lot of applications that are out there and delivering real value, which are still only level 2. And so I think, it's this typical thing, right? It's very broadly distributed. And I think part of the interesting piece as well is how much of a broad church Rasa is in terms of the community and who uses it, right? Because there are folks who are extremely skilled on machine learning and are like machine learning research labs inside of big enterprises, universities. And then there are folks who are developers who are just learning the first pieces of how machine learning works, right? And I think the nice thing about the way that we design the library is that you don't have to know anything, but the more you want to learn, the more you get out. The more you educate yourself, the more you can get out of it, and the more performance you can get out of it. And so you do see differences between like what the most advanced teams can build and what the beginner teams can build, but part of that whole drive around education and content, and I think the biggest thing about Rasa 2.0 is actually the amount of simplification we've done, and how much we've reduced the number of concepts that you're introduced to when you're first building something. So to make it easier to get into the front door, and then easier to kind of graduate once you're in, right?
So how does someone, Alan, and I don't know if this actually exists, at some point, do you think there will be ways for people to get certified in this development process you described, CDD?
I think it's really interesting. So we've just started in the last few months doing Rasa certification workshops. And so it's it's a 1 week thing, and you kind of learn everything about Rasa. And of course, CDD is part of the curriculum, but I'm very interested in the idea of actually accrediting CDD. And what I'm really also interested in right now is adding in other perspectives. So I think the perspectives that we have covered are the end user and the developer, right? Those are perspectives we have covered. But what about the designer and the product owner and all of that, right? And that just putting it out there in the world has stirred all these interesting conversations about, how do we flesh this out? Like, what do these different roles look like? Who does what? So I think there's a lot of sort of fruitful collaboration to be had.
Actually, yeah. So to close, actually, you bring up a good point, because in the ML world, there's growing realization that ML, as it grows in importance, will need to touch many parts of an organization. So the tools need to foster collaboration between the technical side, the product and business side, legal and compliance, security. So all the tooling has to be optimized so that these types of people from different backgrounds can collaborate.
Exactly. And I think what a lot of other sort of conversational AI products and platforms have done is they've said, okay, the solution to that is to make everything low code, no code, and then just make business users responsible for shipping software. And I mean, that's a take.
Yeah.
I think I'd rather have a situation where you still have if you're shipping something mission critical, that you still have, a CI/CD process and sort of professional software set up, and you're writing tests and all the rest of it, but you empower those other teams to contribute in the ways that it makes sense, right? And not in the bug fixing sense.
Right. And with that, thank you, Alan. And it's so great to see Rasa take off. I was a fan from the beginning, and
So you were.
And hopefully the world opens up again and we can see each other in person.
Yeah, I look forward to it.
All right.
Thanks for having me on the show.